The ballroom of Whitmore House had never been a kind place for those who did not belong to it. It was gilded and enormous and lit by a chandelier so heavy that the servants whispered every season that one day it would simply fall and take everyone beneath it with it into the floor, and nobody who deserved it would survive. The walls were paneled in pale green silk that had cost more than most men earned in a decade, and the guests who moved beneath its light wore that particular expression of people who had been born into rooms like this and had never once considered whether they deserved to be in them. It was the 3rd week of June. The season was at its height. Every drawing room in London had been hosting, every hostess had been performing, and the Whitmore Summer Ball was considered by those who considered such things to be the event against which all other events of the season were measured. Lord Whitmore himself was 64, gout-ridden, and entirely indifferent to his own party. His wife, Lady Whitmore, was not. She moved through the room like a woman conducting an orchestra, greeting, placing, steering, arranging the evening with the quiet ferocity of someone who understood that a good party was not an accident but a campaign, and she had been running this particular campaign for 31 years and had never once lost. Nathan Ashford stood near the far window. He was 22 years old, and he was doing the thing he was best at in rooms like this, which was making himself as small as possible without actually leaving. He was not short, he was not unhandsome, he had the Ashford coloring, dark hair, pale eyes, the kind of bone structure that the family portraits in the long gallery at Ashford Park had been preserving across 6 generations with consistent reliability. He was dressed correctly. His cravat was tied without fault, his coat fit without apology, and he stood at the edge of the Whitmore ballroom like a man who understood he was in enemy territory and had decided that stillness was the best available defense. He could not hear the orchestra. He had not been able to hear anything since he was 4 years old, when a fever had taken the sound from the world so completely and so finally that the silence had stopped feeling like absence and had simply become the condition of his existence. He could feel the music, a faint vibration through the floor and through the soles of his shoes, a pulse without meaning, a rhythm without resolution. He could read the room by watching it. He had learned, across 22 years of navigating a world that communicated in a language his body could not receive, to read the shape of conversations from the movements of faces and hands and the angles of bodies, to understand the temperature of a room from the way people held themselves inside it. What he read in the Whitmore ballroom on this particular June evening was that a group of young women near the refreshment table were laughing, and that 3 of them were looking at him, and that the laughter and the looking were connected. He did not need to hear what they were saying. He had spent enough of his life reading the particular quality of that kind of laughter, the bright, easy cruelty of people who had never once had to wonder whether they were welcome in a room and who found the uncertainty of others entertaining. One of the young women turned toward him fully and said something. Her mouth moved with the exaggerated clarity of someone performing for an audience rather than communicating. She was asking him something. He could not read it completely. Her lips moved too fast, too casually, with the thoughtless speed of someone who had never once had to consider whether the person she was speaking to could understand her. He watched her. He kept his face very still. He was practiced at keeping his face still. She said it again, louder this time, and he understood from the way her posture changed that she was making a performance of the repetition, that the loudness was not an accommodation but a mockery, and that the other women were watching with the particular attentiveness of people who expect to be entertained. From across the room, Sebastian Ashford watched his younger brother and did not move. He was 30 years old, and he had been watching Nathan navigate rooms like this for 18 years, and he had learned across those 18 years the specific cost of intervention. Every time he crossed a room to stand beside Nathan, Every time he placed himself between his brother and the thing that was being done to him, he became the story. The protective older brother, the poor deaf boy who needed rescuing. The family embarrassment that required management. He had watched Nathan's face in the aftermath of those interventions, the careful blankness that covered something that hurt worse than the original cruelty, and he had understood that his help was sometimes the sharpest wound. So he stood near the doorway of the Whitmore ballroom, and he watched, and he did not move, and the weight of that stillness was considerable, and he carried it the way he carried most things, without showing anyone that he was carrying it at all. Nathan looked at the young woman and did not answer. He turned back toward the window. He watched the lanterns in the Whitmore garden move in the warm June wind, and he let the laughter behind him be what it was, which was small and temporary and not worth the cost of acknowledging. He had learned this too. The world was full of small cruelties, and most of them passed if you did not feed them with your reaction. He was good at not feeding them. He had become very good at it. But the practice of it was its own kind of exhaustion, and the exhaustion lived in a place behind his sternum that he had been carrying quietly for years without telling anyone it was there. She was standing to his left. He had not seen her arrive near him. She had not come with noise or announcement, or the kind of approach that demanded to be noticed. She was simply there, at the next window, looking out at the same garden, and when he turned, they were standing at the same distance from the glass, looking at the same lanterns, in a silence that was, for the first time that evening, not a painful one. She was not looking at him. She was not performing not looking at him, which was a different thing entirely. She was simply looking at the garden, with the expression of someone who found the garden more interesting than the ballroom, which was, Nathan thought, an extremely reasonable position to hold. She had dark hair dressed simply. Her gown was a deep blue that had nothing fashionable about it and everything right. She stood with the ease of someone who was comfortable being still, who did not need the room to notice her, and who had not come here tonight to be noticed. She turned eventually, with the unhurried movement of someone who had become aware of a presence without being startled by it, and she looked at him. Her expression did not change. There was no flicker of surprise, no recalibration, no moment of adjustment. She simply looked at him the way one looks at a person, which sounds like a small thing and is, in practice, a very large one. And he had learned to notice the difference across 22 years of being looked at in every other way. He did not know what she saw. He watched her face for the particular sequence that he had learned to dread, the moment of realization, the moment of compensation, the brightness that appeared when people decided to be kind to him, which was its own species of condescension. It did not come. She held his gaze for a moment, with the directness of someone who was simply seeing him and had no complicated feelings about what she saw, and then she looked back at the garden. He looked back at the garden too. They stood like that for a while. He did not know how long. The vibration of the orchestra continued through the floor. The lanterns continued to move, and the quality of the silence between them was the best thing that had happened to him all evening. She left without ceremony. She did not say goodbye, because there was no goodbye to say, because they had not spoken, because they had simply been standing near each other in the same silence, and then she was gone, and he was standing at the window alone again, and the room was the same room it had been before, gilded and loud and not built for him. But something had changed in a way he could not name yet, and he stood at the window for a long time afterward, watching the lanterns, thinking about the quality of that silence, and the face that had held no adjustment and no performance and no effort to be kind. Sebastian had seen her leave. He had been watching his brother's face at the window. The careful stillness, the way something had shifted in the angle of his shoulders, the way the exhaustion behind Nathan's sternum became, for a few minutes, something that looked almost like ease. and he had watched the woman who had caused that shift, the way she stood, the way she looked, the way she left, without making her leaving into a production. He did not know who she was. He intended to find out. He found out from Lady Whitmore, who knew everyone and their circumstances, with the thoroughness of someone who had made knowing into a vocation. The woman's name was Clara Winthrop. She was 26. She was the daughter of the late Arthur Winthrop, who had been a respectable barrister with a reasonable income and no title, and her mother had died when Clara was 16, and she had been managing her family's diminished circumstances since then, with the particular competence of someone who had not been given the option of doing otherwise. She had a younger brother who had died 3 years ago, and Lady Whitmore mentioned this piece of information with the delicacy of someone who understood that grief was not suitable material for ballroom conversation, which meant she mentioned it quickly and then moved on, and Sebastian filed it away. He did not know yet why the detail mattered. He knew, in the way that some things make themselves known before you understand why, that it did. If you have ever watched someone you love try to be invisible in a room, if you have ever stood at the edge of a gathering and felt the specific weight of trying to take up less space than you need, stay with this story, because this story is for you, and what happens next is going to matter. Subscribe now so you do not miss a single chapter. Sebastian Ashford had been the Duke of Ashford for 3 years. He had inherited the title at 27 when their father had died of a sudden illness in the winter, and he had inherited along with it the estate, the responsibilities, the parliamentary seat, the 11,000 acres of Devonshire farmland, and the particular weight of a name that carried expectation in every room it entered. He had also inherited the question of Nathan. Not that Nathan was a question. Nathan was his brother, and Sebastian had never, not once in 30 years, thought of his brother as a problem or a burden or an embarrassment or anything other than the person he loved most in the world. But the world had opinions about Nathan, and the world made those opinions known in the specific way that worlds make things known to people who have power, which is quietly, sideways, in the form of advice and concern, and the carefully worded suggestions of men who meant well and understood nothing. He had received, in 3 years as Duke, 17 separate pieces of correspondence from various well-meaning associates regarding Nathan's situation. The word situation appeared in many of them. Some suggested institutions. Some suggested the continent, which was considered a humane form of distance. Some suggested, with the particular delicacy of people who found directness uncomfortable, that Nathan might be happier somewhere that could better accommodate his particular. And here most of the letters found different words, his particular condition. Sebastian had kept every letter. He had kept them in a separate drawer in his study at Ashford Park, not because he intended to answer them, but because he found that anger, properly contained, was a useful fuel, and he wanted to have access to it whenever he needed to be reminded what he was working against. What he was working against was a world that looked at his brother and saw a limitation rather than a person. He had spent 3 years trying to build walls against that world on Nathan's behalf, and the walls had been solid and necessary, and he was beginning to understand. Possibly also a form of cage. He had not meant it that way. He had meant it as protection. He had taught Nathan, carefully and consistently, and with the best intentions available to a 27-year-old, who was suddenly responsible for everything, to move through society without advertising what the world would use against him. He had taught him to hold himself still when he could not hear what was being said. He had taught him to watch faces for cues, to time his responses, to manage the impression he made with the precision of a performance. He had taught him, without quite meaning to keep his hands at his sides in company, because the language Nathan spoke most fluently, the language he had learned as a child from the books their mother had found, and the private tutor she had hired, and the natural grammar of his own hands and body, was not a language that polite society recognized as a language at all. He had not taught Nathan to be ashamed of it. He had taught him to keep it private. He was beginning to understand that there was not much difference between the two. He decided to leave London. He made the decision 3 days after the Whitmore ball, on a Tuesday morning in his study at the London house, after he had read a letter from his land steward regarding the summer accounts, and after he had looked up from the letter and caught Nathan sitting in the chair by the window, with a book in his hands and an expression on his face that was the careful blankness of someone who had stopped expecting the day to hold anything worth feeling. He had looked at his brother for a long moment. Nathan had not looked up, because Nathan had not heard him look. And the silence between them was the silence of two people in the same room who were not, in any way that mattered, in the same room. Sebastian put the letter down. He called for Hartley, his secretary, and told him to send a letter to Lord Harrington's estate in Dorset, where they had been invited, every summer for the past several years, to come and stay as long as they liked. He told Hartley to tell Lord Harrington they would be arriving in 10 days. He told Hartley not to mention the title. He signed the letter as Mr. Ashford. It was a small decision. He made it quickly, without fully thinking through the implications, because he was, at that moment, more interested in the expression on his brother's face by the window than in the philosophical complications of what it might mean to spend a summer in the country as something other than the Duke of Ashford. He wanted Nathan to be somewhere without the weight of London, without the weight of the season, without the ballrooms and the parties and the young women who performed their cruelty in front of people who watched and found it entertaining. He wanted Nathan to be somewhere that was not a campaign, and, though he did not admit this clearly to himself, until later, he wanted to understand something about the woman who had stood at the window of the Whitmore ballroom and looked at his brother without rearranging her face. Harrington Hall was everything that a Dorset estate in summer should be. The grounds were extensive and wild, in the way that old estates go wild when the family that owns them cares more about the land than the appearance of caring about it, which is, in the end, the only way to have land that is worth anything. The kitchen garden was enormous and enthusiastically productive. The rose garden had gone slightly beyond itself in the warm June weather, and was now a controlled chaos of color and fragrance that smelled, when the afternoon wind came off the fields, like something that should not be real, but insistently was. Lord Harrington himself was 68 years old, broad and comfortable and fond of his dinner, and he greeted Sebastian at the front steps with the warmth of a man who had known the Ashford family for 4 decades, and had long since stopped needing to perform anything in their presence. He shook Sebastian's hand and clapped him on the shoulder, and said it was good to see the boy, and then he looked at Nathan and said it was good to see this one too, and the way he said it, without adjustment, without the particular brightness of effort, made Sebastian feel something release in his chest that he had not known he was holding. Nathan had looked at Lord Harrington's face and read the welcome in it, and something in his posture had changed, the very small change of a person who has walked into a room and found, unexpectedly, that the room is not against them. They were shown to their rooms by a young footman named Thomas, who moved through the corridors with the cheerful efficiency of someone who enjoyed his work and was not self-conscious about showing it. The rooms were good. The windows looked over the rose garden. The beds were the kind of beds that announced their quality through comfort rather than show, and Sebastian stood at the window of his room for a moment after Thomas had left and looked at the garden and felt, for the first time in several weeks, something that was close to ease. He did not think about Clara Winthrop. He thought about the estate accounts he had brought with him and the parliamentary correspondence he owed 3 responses to, and the question of what Nathan might do with a summer in a place that did not require him to be invisible. He was very successful at not thinking about Clara Winthrop for approximately 6 hours. She was at dinner. She was seated 3 places from him on the left side of the table, between a retired naval officer named Captain Fellows and Lord Harrington's youngest daughter, Eleanor, who was 17 and enchanted by everything, and was directing most of her enchantment this evening at Captain Fellows, who bore it with good humor of a man who has survived considerably worse. Sebastian saw her when he entered the dining room and stopped in the doorway for 1 moment, which was 1 moment more than he intended, before he moved to his chair with the controlled movement of a man who has noticed something and has decided not to show that he has noticed it. She did not look up when he sat down. She was in conversation with Eleanor, who was explaining something with great enthusiasm using both hands, and Clara was listening with the full attention of someone who found the enthusiasms of 17-year-olds genuinely interesting, and was not performing that interest. She was in deep green tonight. She wore no jewelry except a small pin at her collar, something dark and quiet, a piece that was not trying to impress anyone. Her hair was dressed the same way it had been at the Whitmore ball, simply, without the elaborate construction that the season demanded of women who wanted to be noticed, and she was not trying to be noticed, and she was, as a direct result, impossible to look away from. He looked away. He applied himself to the excellent soup. He spoke to Captain Fellows about the situation in the eastern counties regarding the wool trade, which was a topic he had genuine opinions about, and which served the purpose of occupying his mind with something other than the woman 3 seats to his left, who was, he became aware over the course of the next 20 minutes, extraordinarily good at listening. He watched her, in the way that is possible at dinner tables, the sideways attention that passes for ordinary social observation. She listened to Eleanor with complete attention. She listened to Captain Fellows when he included her in the conversation. She asked questions that were the questions of someone who was actually interested in the answers, not the questions designed to be charming, not the questions that were really statements requiring agreement. She said something to Eleanor that made the girl laugh, a real laugh, unguarded, and Captain Fellows smiled, and Lord Harrington, from his end of the table, looked over with the expression of a man who approves of the atmosphere at his table. Nathan was seated further down, near Lord Harrington's eldest son, James, who was 25 and good-natured and had the particular gift of some people of communicating warmth without words, in a way that reached past the obstacles that words created. Sebastian watched his brother eat his soup and watched the table with the careful attention of a man reading a room, and he watched James Harrington lean over occasionally and write something briefly on the small card he had brought, apparently for this purpose, and slide it to Nathan, and he watched Nathan read it and respond, and the responses were, he could see from the angle of Nathan's face, things that made James smile. He had not arranged this. He had not asked Lord Harrington to brief his son. He did not know how James Harrington had known to bring a card and pen to dinner for the specific purpose of talking to a deaf man. He filed this too, in the category of things that mattered without yet being fully understood. He did not speak to Clara that evening. She left the dining room before the gentlemen rejoined the ladies, pleading tiredness, and Lord Harrington said she had been traveling and needed rest, with the ease of a man who ran a house where people were allowed to be tired without it requiring explanation. Sebastian sat with Lord Harrington and Captain Fellows and James afterward, drinking rather good port, and discussing the summer and the state of the roads in Dorset, and he went to bed at a reasonable hour and lay in the dark with the window open and the smell of the rose garden coming in on the warm night air, and did not think about Clara Winthrop until he was almost asleep, and then thought about her quite clearly for approximately 20 minutes before finally, firmly going to sleep. He met her in the rose garden the next morning, This was, strictly speaking, an accident. He had gone out early, before breakfast, because he was a man who thought better when he was moving, and the rose garden was the obvious direction from the east wing of the house. And she was there before him, which meant she was also a person who went out early, and this was not information he had sought and was not responsible for having. She was standing at the center of the garden where the paths crossed, looking at a particular climbing rose that had gone aggressively up the stone wall and was now investigating the possibilities of the window above it, with the ambition of a plant that has decided it deserves more space than it has been given. She heard him on the gravel, or felt it, and turned, and their eyes met with the particular directness of two people who are not expecting each other and have no performance prepared. She said, "Good morning." He said, "Good morning." They stood for a moment in the crossing of the paths with the rose garden around them, and the morning was very quiet and very green, and he thought again about the quality of her stillness, the way she occupied space, without apologizing for it, and without requiring it to confirm anything about her. She said the climbing rose was going to take the window by the end of July if nobody intervened. He said Lord Harrington had probably given the rose permission. She considered this and said she thought that was likely, and that the window seemed willing. He laughed, which surprised him because it came quickly, without the small delay that usually preceded it in company, the delay in which he decided whether the laugh was appropriate and whether it would be understood. It simply came. She looked at him when he laughed, not with surprise, but with the small recognition of someone who has said a thing and found it landed, and the expression on her face was the expression of a person who is quietly pleased and has no need to make a production of being pleased. She asked how he knew Lord Harrington. He explained, briefly, that their families had been connected for many years, that his father and Lord Harrington had been at school together, and the friendship had outlasted all the things that school friendships usually failed to outlast. She said that was rare. He agreed that it was. She said she had known Lord Harrington through her father, who had done legal work for the estate some years ago, and Lord Harrington had been kind when her family's circumstances had changed, and she had been glad to accept his invitation for the summer. She said this without making it into a confession, without the apology that people of diminished circumstances sometimes inserted into simple statements of fact, without the brightness that was its own form of defensiveness. She said it the way one says a true thing about oneself to a person who has asked, and then she looked at the climbing rose again, and Sebastian stood in the morning garden and felt the specific sensation of being in the presence of someone who was not performing anything at all. He asked her, and he was not sure why he asked it, what she had done the previous winter. She looked at him. It was, he understood, an unusual question for a morning garden in Dorset, not the kind of question that opened conversations at country house parties. She considered it seriously, the way she seemed to consider most things. She said she had spent the winter working on a project she had been working on for 3 years, which was the establishment of a school, and she said this and then stopped, and he understood from the way she stopped that there was more to it, and that she had decided not to say the more of it yet, and he did not press, because he had the sense that pressing Clara Winthrop toward anything she had not decided to move toward would simply result in her not moving. He asked what kind of school. She looked at him for a moment, and then she said, quietly, a school for deaf children, and she said it the way someone says a thing they have said to many people, and have learned to watch the face of the person hearing it for the quality of their response. He kept his face very still. Not with the stillness of someone concealing a reaction, but with the stillness of someone who was receiving information and wanted to receive it fully before responding. He asked where. She said she was still looking for the right support. She said there were expenses she could not cover from her own means, and she had been writing letters, and the letters had not been answered in the ways she had hoped, and she was not discouraged, and her chin lifted very slightly as she said she was not discouraged, and he thought that the lift of her chin was the only place in her composure where the difficulty of the previous 3 years was visible. He thought about the drawers in his study at Ashford Park, the one with the 17 letters about Nathan's situation. He thought about the word situation. He thought about the expression on Nathan's face at the window of the London house on a Tuesday morning, the careful blankness of someone who has stopped expecting the day to hold anything worth feeling. He did not say any of these things. He said the school sounded like something worth the effort. She looked at him, and the look was the look of someone deciding whether a response is genuine or social, and he held the look without flinching, and after a moment something in her face settled, and she said yes. She thought it was. They walked back toward the house together. The gravel was still wet from the night, and their footsteps were quiet, and the morning was still doing the thing that early mornings do in the country in summer, which is be more beautiful than anything you plan to encounter. And they walked without talking, and the silence was the second good silence he had been in with her, and he was beginning to form a theory about the silences of Clara Winthrop, which was that they were not the silences of someone who had nothing to say, but the silences of someone who had decided that the saying of things required them to be worth saying, and this was a standard he found he did not object to. At the door of the house, she said it was nice to meet him properly. He said the same. She went in. He stood on the step for a moment in the morning, with the rose garden behind him and the understanding settling into him that he was going to have to be very careful, because whatever this was, it was not something he had planned for and was not something he knew how to manage. And he was a man who was accustomed to managing things, and the fact that this particular thing did not appear to be interested in being managed was, he thought, probably significant. Nathan found Clara before Sebastian had decided what to do about finding her himself. It happened in the rose garden 3 days after Sebastian's own morning encounter there, and Sebastian was not present for it, and he learned about it afterward, which was perhaps better, because what happened there was not something that needed an audience. Nathan had gone out in the mid-morning with his sketchbook, which he carried everywhere, and filled with a particular attention to detail of someone whose relationship to the visual world was, by necessity and nature, more complete than most people's. He drew everything. He drew the architecture of the Harrington estate with the precision of someone who found comfort in the rendering of structure. He drew the kitchen garden in a state of productive chaos that the kitchen staff would not have recognized as the compliment it was. He drew Lord Harrington's oldest hound, a creature of considerable age and dignity, with the tenderness of someone who understood that dignity did not require the ability to move quickly. He was drawing the climbing rose when Clara appeared at the garden gate. She did not know he was there. She came in with the ease of someone who had established, over several days, a comfortable relationship with Lord Harrington's gardens, and she was carrying a small notebook of her own, and she saw Nathan seated on the stone bench at the side of the garden. And she stopped, and the stopping was simply the stopping of a person who had not expected to find someone there, not the stopping of someone who had found something complicated. She moved quietly to the other side of the garden. She did not want to disturb him. She sat on the grass at the base of the far wall, which was not a very proper thing to do in a morning dress, and she opened her notebook, and she did not look at Nathan, and Nathan did not look at her, and they worked in parallel in the morning garden, and the silence between them was the good kind. It was Nathan who looked up first. He looked up because the light had shifted, and he wanted to see what the rose looked like in the new light, and he found Clara instead, across the garden, writing in her notebook with the focused attention of someone who was not looking at him, and was, for that reason, the most comfortable person he had shared a garden with in considerable time. She looked up and found him looking, and she did not perform a greeting. She raised her hand in a small, specific gesture. It was not a wave. It was not the vague social hand movement that served as acknowledgement from a distance. It was a sign. He recognized it in the space of a heartbeat, the kind of recognition that lives in the body before the mind has time to name it. It was the sign for hello, simple and unambiguous, and she had made it with the ease of someone for whom it was a natural language. Not an accommodation, not a performance of knowing, not the awkward attempt of a well-meaning person who has learned one gesture and deploys it with the specific brightness of someone expecting to be thanked for it. She signed hello the way one says hello, simply to a person as the beginning of a conversation, and Nathan put down his pencil. For a moment he did not respond. He had not used sign language with anyone outside of the private rooms of his own home in 3 years. Sebastian had not forbidden it. Sebastian had not needed to forbid it. He had taught Nathan, carefully and consistently and with love, that the world would respond better to him if he did not advertise the ways in which he was different. And Nathan had internalized this teaching the way children internalize the things they are taught by the people who love them most, which is completely and without quite realizing he was doing it. He raised his hands. He signed back. He signed hello, and the quality of the morning changed entirely because he had not done this, here, in this way, in a garden with another person, in a very long time, and the feeling of his hands moving in the language that came most naturally to him was something between relief and grief, and something he did not have a word for in any language. Clara smiled. It was not the smile of someone being kind. It was the smile of a person who is in a conversation they find genuinely interesting and is pleased about that. And she signed something back, a question, asking him what he was drawing. He held up the sketchbook. She stood from the grass, which required some rearrangement of her skirts, and crossed the garden to look at it, and she stood beside him and looked at the drawing of the climbing rose. And her face was the face of someone seeing something done well, and having no complicated feelings about saying so, and she signed it. She told him it was very good, and he watched her hands and felt the words arrive in the way that words in sign arrived, not as sound but as shape and movement and meaning assembled by a grammar his mind had been built to receive. He asked her where she had learned. She told him about Julian. She did not tell it the way people tell stories they have packaged for telling. She told it the way things that are still true and still present in the body get told, simply, without decoration, in pieces rather than in the polished form of a narrative that has been completed. She told him about her brother, who had lost his hearing at 7 after a fever, and the silence afterward, the enormous, strange silence that had fallen over their household, and how she had been 12 and had understood. In the clear-eyed way that children understand things before they learn to be complicated about them, that if she did not learn to talk to Julian in the way Julian could be talked to, she would lose her brother even while he was still present. So she had learned. She had found books, and she had found a woman in the village who had a deaf son and had taught herself to teach, and she had spent 2 years learning and making mistakes, and learning from the mistakes and building, with Julian, a language between them that was partly formal and partly invented, the private grammar of 2 people who have decided to understand each other. And Julian had died at 19 3 years ago, of the same constitution that had taken his hearing, and the language they had built together had not died with him, and she had decided that the language was too important to let it become only a grief. So she used it. She taught it when she could find people to teach. She had been writing to schools and donors and institutions for 3 years, trying to find the support to build a place where the language was not a private thing, not a family secret, not an accommodation made in quiet corners of gardens by women who felt the need to apologize for knowing it, but a real language, spoken and taught, and given the dignity of a curriculum. Nathan had listened to all of this, not with the careful attention of someone waiting for the story to finish, but with the full presence of someone who was receiving it and letting it matter. And when she finished, he did not say the things that well-meaning people said to him when they told him things that were intended to be moving. He signed something back. He signed that Julian was lucky to have had her. And then, after a moment, he signed something else, smaller, more careful. He signed that he had not talked like this, really talked, with someone who was not Sebastian in a very long time. Clara looked at him. Her expression was not pity. It was not the softening of someone deciding to be gentle with something fragile. It was the expression of a person who has just understood something about the shape of another person's life, and has found that the shape corresponds in some way to the shape of their own, and who is taking a moment to let that recognition be real before saying anything about it. She said, with her hands, that she understood what that was like, to have a whole language and nowhere to use it. He said yes. They sat in the rose garden together, in the warm mid-morning, and they talked. They talked the way people talk when they have found unexpectedly that they are in the presence of someone who is speaking their language, which is with the slightly giddy quality of relief, and the pleasure of not having to translate themselves, and the ease of a conversation that does not require management. They talked about drawing and about the difference between drawing from memory and drawing from life, and about whether the drawings that were most accurate were the ones that looked most like the thing, or the ones that felt most like the thing. They invented 2 new signs together, one for the specific quality of morning light in a garden, which required a particular movement of the fingers that neither of them had seen before, and both of them recognized as right when they found it, and one for the feeling of a silence that was comfortable, which was a small gesture near the chest that meant something that neither of them could have said in words in either of their languages as precisely as that small gesture said it. Sebastian found them there at 11:30, when he came looking for Nathan for the luncheon that Lord Harrington's cook had been preparing with the seriousness that Lord Harrington's cook brought to all preparations. He came through the garden gate and stopped. They were seated on the stone bench, side by side, their hands moving between them, and Nathan's face had the expression Sebastian had been watching for across 22 years, the expression he had seen only in private, only in the rooms of their own home, only in the moments when Nathan did not need to manage the impression he was making on the world. He was simply present. He was simply himself. He was laughing at something, and the laugh was the laugh Sebastian knew from childhood, unguarded, easy, the laugh of someone who has forgotten to be careful about what they let show. Sebastian stood in the garden gate and did not announce himself, and what he felt standing there was complicated, and he understood, in the way that true things make themselves understood rather than argued, that the complication was not about Clara Winthrop, it was about himself. He had spent 3 years building walls on Nathan's behalf. He had spent 3 years teaching Nathan to keep his hands still in company, to manage the impression, to make himself legible to a world that found his difference inconvenient. He had done it with love. He had done it because the world was cruel, and he had wanted to give Nathan the best possible armor against that cruelty. He had not understood, until this moment in this garden, watching his brother's hands move freely in the morning air, that armor and cage could be the same construction, depending on whether the person wearing it had chosen it. He stood in the garden gate for a long time, long enough that the morning moved around him, the light shifting slightly, a bird crossing the far wall, the climbing rose making no comment on what it had witnessed. He stood until Nathan looked up and saw him, and the expression on Nathan's face in the moment of seeing him was not guilt, because Nathan had not done anything wrong, but there was something in it, a small bracing, the almost imperceptible preparation of someone who expects, from long habit, that what comes next will require him to adjust himself back to the shape the world prefers. Sebastian felt that small bracing like a hand around his throat. He stepped into the garden. He walked toward the bench with the deliberate movement of someone who is choosing how to arrive rather than simply arriving. He signed hello to Nathan. This was not unusual. He signed to Nathan in private. He had always signed to Nathan in private. But they were not in private. They were in Lord Harrington's rose garden on a Wednesday morning, with Clara Winthrop sitting on the bench beside his brother, and Sebastian signed hello in front of her without making it into a thing, because he had decided, in the walk between the gate and the bench, that making it into a thing was precisely what he was not going to do. Nathan's face did the small change that Sebastian had been watching for 30 years, and still found difficult to describe, the small change of someone who has been seen rather than managed, and who did not quite know what to do with the experience. Clara looked at Sebastian. Her expression was the expression he had been learning over 3 days, which was not warm and not cool, but simply direct. The expression of someone looking at the thing in front of them, without having decided in advance what to make of it. She signed hello to him. He signed back. He realized as he did it that this was the first time he had used sign language in front of someone who was not Nathan or the private tutor Nathan had had as a child, and the realization was not accompanied by the discomfort he might have expected. It was accompanied by something that was closer to the recognition that the rose garden was warmer than the rest of the estate, and he had not understood why until now. Luncheon was good. It was good the way that lunches at Lord Harrington's table were always good, with the generosity of a man who genuinely enjoyed feeding people and had the means to do so without ostentation. They sat at the long table in the dining room, all 5 of them, and the conversation was the conversation of a summer house party, where people have begun to relax into each other, where the performances of the first days have given way to the easier exchanges of people who have accepted that they will be in the same place for a while and might as well be comfortable about it. James Harrington was talking about the estate's new drainage project with the enthusiasm that James brought to all practical problems, which was considerable and unfeigned, and Captain Fellows was arguing that the solution was simpler than James believed, and Lord Harrington was smiling at both of them, with the expression of a man who has heard this particular argument before, and is waiting with patience for it to reach the same conclusion it always reached. Nathan was following the conversation with the practiced attention of a man who reads lips and faces, tracking between James and Captain Fellows and Lord Harrington with the quick movement of eyes that have learned to be quick. Clara was seated beside him. Sebastian watched her do something so small that he almost missed it. She was writing, very briefly, on the corner of the card that James had left at Nathan's place setting. She wrote a single word, the summary of the argument, the point that Nathan was perhaps not fully catching in the rapid exchange between James and Captain Fellows, and she slid it to him without ceremony, without looking at him to see whether he received it, without the performance of helpfulness that helpfulness sometimes became. She simply made the information available and returned to her own plate, and Nathan read the word, and his face did the small thing that meant he had caught the thread, and he looked at Captain Fellows with the expression of someone who has an opinion about drainage systems and has just been given the opportunity to have it. Sebastian watched this. He cut a piece of roast without looking at it. He watched his brother enter a conversation at a table, fully, without apology, with the assistance of one written word on a corner of a card, and he thought about 3 years of London dinners and Whitmore ballrooms, and the careful performance of normality, and he thought about the fact that he had never once thought of doing what Clara had just done, because he had been so focused on the wall he was building for Nathan that he had forgotten to look at whether the wall had a door. If you are someone who has ever loved a person so much that you built them a cage and called it protection, if you have ever taught someone to be smaller than they are because the world was unkind and you wanted to spare them from it, then stay with this, because what Sebastian understands next is going to sit with you for a long time. Like this video and follow along, because this story has more to say. The afternoon passed quietly. Sebastian worked in the library on the correspondence he had brought with him, which had not diminished simply because he had come to Dorset, and the parliamentary letter he owed a response to was not going to respond to itself. He wrote with his usual efficiency and his usual thoroughness, and he noted to himself, somewhat less efficient than usual, because the window of the library looked over the East Garden, and Clara was in the East Garden in the mid-afternoon, reading a book with the focused stillness of someone who had found a good spot and had no intention of being moved from it. He did not watch her, he wrote his letters. He thought about what she had said in the rose garden that morning, about the school, about the letters that had not been answered in the ways she had hoped. He thought about this in a specific, practical way that was his nature when he encountered a problem, which was to consider what resources existed and what the shape of the problem actually was, and whether the resources and the shape could be made to fit each other. He thought about this for approximately 45 minutes before he accepted what he was actually doing, which was finding a reason that had nothing to do with Clara Winthrop specifically, to think about Clara Winthrop specifically, and he put down his pen and looked out the library window at the East Garden, and was honest with himself about it for about 3 minutes, and then he picked his pen back up and finished the letter, because the letter still needed finishing, regardless of what else was true. He found her at dinner that evening in conversation with Lord Harrington about the legal history of the estate, which was, it turned out, a subject she knew in considerable detail from her father's work, and Lord Harrington was delighted by this, and had produced a document from somewhere that bore the Winthrop name, and was explaining it with the enthusiasm of a man who loves his own history, and rarely finds a dinner guest who shares the enthusiasm. Sebastian sat on Lord Harrington's other side and listened, and Clara spoke about legal history with the same directness and the same lack of performance that she brought to every subject. And Lord Harrington said she was her father's daughter, and Clara's face did the small thing it did when something mattered, the thing where nothing changed but the quality of the stillness did. After dinner, the party gathered in the drawing room, and Eleanor played the pianoforte with more enthusiasm than precision, and Captain Fellows listened with the patience of a man for whom music was something that happened to other people, and he had long since made peace with it, and James Harrington stood near the window with Nathan, and was doing something with his hands that Sebastian, from across the room, recognized as an attempt to learn a sign or two, and Nathan was teaching him with the patience and slight amusement of someone who has found an unexpectedly willing student. Sebastian crossed the room to where Clara stood, near the bookcase, with a cup of tea. He stood beside her. She looked at him. He said good evening, and she said good evening, and they were quiet for a moment while Eleanor navigated a particularly ambitious passage and succeeded in finishing it, if not quite in the way the composer had intended. He said he had been thinking about what she had told him in the rose garden. She did not ask him what he meant. She waited. He said he would like to hear more about the school, the details, the costs, the specific obstacles, the kind of support she was looking for. She turned to look at him fully. There was something evaluating in the look, not unfriendly, but the look of someone who has been disappointed enough times to have learned to assess, before proceeding, whether the person she is talking to is actually interested, or is performing interest in the specific way that certain people performed interest in order to receive something in return. He held the look. He did not try to make it easier or more comfortable. He simply held it and waited for her to decide. She said she had written 3 years ago to a number of potential donors, and that among them had been the Duke of Ashford, who had a known interest in educational reform, and whose name appeared in the records of several charitable educational ventures, and whose estate was within an area where the school might naturally serve. He kept his face very still. She said the Duke's secretary had replied. The letter had been courteous and brief. It had thanked her for her proposal and informed her that the Duke's charitable commitments were fully subscribed at present and that her proposal would be kept on file. She said this without heat, which was more interesting than if she had said it with heat, because the absence of heat in Clara Winthrop on a subject that clearly mattered to her was not indifference, but something more controlled than indifference, the controlled quality of someone who has moved through a disappointment and has not let it define her direction, but has not forgotten it either. He said that was a loss, and he meant it with a precision that she could not fully understand yet. And she looked at him when he said it, and he thought she heard more in it than she could account for, and she chose not to press on it, and instead told him about the school. She told him what she wanted, which was specific and practical, and had been thought about for 3 years with the thoroughness of someone who had done the research and the mathematics, and had built the plan to a level of detail that meant the only thing missing was the resource. She wanted a building in a location that served a population of deaf children who currently had no educational provision. She wanted teachers who used sign language as the primary medium of instruction. She wanted a curriculum that treated deaf children as children who needed education rather than as problems that needed managing. She had found in 3 years of looking that there were teachers who had the skills and wanted the work and needed only the institutional framework and the funding to make it happen. She had found that the children existed in abundance, children like Julian, children like Nathan. She did not say his name, but Sebastian understood. It was there. Children who were living in a world that could not talk to them and had decided, based on this failure, that they could not be educated. She said all of this with the controlled passion of someone who has been saying it for 3 years and has not been heard and has kept saying it anyway, and the specific quality of keeping saying a thing that is not being heard is, Sebastian thought, one of the most revealing things about a person, because it shows you what they believe when the belief is not producing results, and what Clara Winthrop believed was not conditional on results and had never been. He said he would like to help. She looked at him. He said he understood that he was a man she had met 3 days ago at a country house party, and that offers of help from men at country house parties were not necessarily reliable, and that he was not asking her to believe the offer before she had evidence for believing it, but that he was making it. He said he meant it, and he would like the opportunity to demonstrate that he meant it. She was quiet for a moment. Eleanor played the final notes of the piece, and everyone offered appropriate applause, and Eleanor glowed with the specific pleasure of 17, and was immediately preparing to play something else. Clara said she would think about it. She said it without warmth and without coldness. She said it with the straightness of someone who says what they mean and means what they say, and has decided that that is a sufficient answer. And he accepted it, and they turned back toward the room, and he felt, standing beside her in the drawing room of Harrington Hall, with Eleanor beginning the opening notes of something ambitious, that he was navigating something that he did not have a map for, and that the absence of the map was not, as it usually was, uncomfortable, but was instead the particular quality of a country he had not been to before and found himself interested in exploring. The following days had the quality of summer days at a country house party, where something is happening that nobody has named, but everyone in the house is aware of, which is the quality of a current moving beneath a still surface, the sense that the arrangement of things is not quite what it was 3 days ago and is not yet what it is becoming. Lord Harrington noticed. He noticed in the way that men of 68, who have been watching people at their dinner table for 40 years, notice things, which is without appearing to notice, and with a satisfaction that they do not feel the need to express. And Sebastian caught him once with an expression of composed pleasure at a moment that was not, strictly speaking, an occasion for composed pleasure, and he understood that Lord Harrington approved and had decided to let events develop at their own speed, which was the kind of oversight that Sebastian appreciated, and that Lord Harrington had always been very good at. Nathan and Clara spent the mornings in the rose garden. This became, over the course of a week, an established pattern that nobody commented on and everybody accepted, and the rose garden became a kind of territory that belonged to them in the specific way that places belong to people who have found something important there, not exclusively, not formally, but with the quiet certainty of a place that knows its function. Sebastian saw them from the library window most mornings and did not join them. He had understood from the moment in the garden gate that whatever was happening between his brother and Clara Winthrop was not something he should enter. Not because he was unwelcome, but because it was not his, and his presence in it would change its quality in the way that an observer always changes the thing observed. He let it be. He was learning, that summer, to let things be that he had spent 3 years managing. It was harder than he had expected and more necessary than he had understood. He talked to Nathan about it one evening, the kind of talking they did, which was not the managed conversation of a duke and his ward, but the conversation of 2 brothers who had been close enough across 30 years to say things to each other that were difficult to say. They were in Nathan's room, which had the sketchbooks across every available surface and the particular atmosphere of a room that a person has occupied in the way that means they have felt comfortable in it, and Sebastian was sitting in the chair by the window, and Nathan was on the bed, and the evening light was the long gold light of June evenings in Dorset, and Nathan was signing and Sebastian was signing back, and this was the way they talked when they were not in company, when the performance was set down. Sebastian said that he had made mistakes. Nathan looked at him. Sebastian said he had taught Nathan to manage himself in ways that were not always for Nathan's benefit, and that he had thought it was protection, and he understood now that it was also cost, and that he was sorry for the cost in the same way that he was not sorry for the love that had driven the protection, which was completely and not at all. Nathan was quiet for a moment. He signed something. He signed that Sebastian had done his best. Sebastian said he knew that, and that the knowing it did not mean it had been enough. Nathan signed something else. He signed that Clara had told him that the reason she had kept trying to build the school, even when the letters were not answered, and the donors were not found, and the institution she was trying to build remained only a set of plans and a belief, was that she had decided that Julian deserved something lasting, and that what she could make last was not Julian himself but the language he had spoken and the world he deserved to have had. He signed this carefully, with the attention of someone reproducing something that had been given to him, and that he wanted to transmit correctly. And Sebastian listened with his eyes and his hands, and understood that his brother was, in some way, telling him something about himself, about what deserved to be lasting, about the language that deserved to be spoken. He sat with it. The evening light moved. He said, finally, that he intended to fund the school. Nathan looked at him. He said he intended to fund it fully, and that he was going to tell Clara, and that he was going to tell her who he was when he did, because he had understood that not telling her who he was had been a choice he made for himself, to be seen without the title, and that the choice had been reasonable at the start, and had become something that sat less well with him the more time he spent in her company, because Clara Winthrop was not a person you could build things with on a foundation that was missing something important. Nathan signed something. He signed "You going to tell her the rest of it?" Sebastian asked what the rest of it was. Nathan signed it in the small, careful way that he had when he was saying something that was true, and that he thought mattered, and that he was not sure would be received. And what he signed was that Sebastian had been watching Clara from the library window every morning for 8 days, and that this was not, in his opinion, the behavior of a man who was simply interested in funding a charitable educational venture. Sebastian looked at his brother. He said nothing for a moment. He said with his hands that Nathan was correct. Nathan signed something that was the sign they had invented in childhood, for I know and have been waiting for you to work it out, which was a particular movement that was entirely theirs, and that no book of sign language had ever contained, and Sebastian looked at it and felt the specific thing of being known by the person who has known you longest, which is the most complete form of the feeling and the most impossible to describe. He told her the next morning. He told her in the rose garden, which was, by that point, the place where things that mattered were said, and the climbing rose had continued its investigation of the window above it, and had made considerable progress, and the morning was the warm, golden morning of Dorset in late June, and they were standing in the crossing of the paths where they had stood on the first morning, and he told her. He said his name was Sebastian Ashford, and that he was the Duke of Ashford, and that he had come to Harrington Hall as Mr. Ashford, because he had wanted Nathan to have a summer without the weight of the title in every room, and that this was true and was also not the complete truth, because the other part of the truth was that he had seen her at the Whitmore ball and had wanted to find out who she was without the title preceding him into the finding out. She looked at him. She stood very still. He watched her face and saw the things moving through it, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the careful deliberateness of a person whose composure was not performance but nature, and who was moving through something and not letting the moving be shown until she had finished it. She said she knew. He paused. She said she had known since the 3rd day. She said Lord Harrington's estate correspondence had included, in her father's records, a letter from the previous Duke of Ashford, which bore the Ashford crest, and which she had recognized on the 3rd morning when she had been helping Eleanor organize some of Lord Harrington's older documents, and she had seen the crest, and she had seen the letter, and the letter was signed with a name, and she had looked at Sebastian across the dinner table that evening, and she had known. He absorbed this. He said he was sorry for the deception. She said she understood why he had made it. She said she was not without some sympathy for a man who wanted to know whether the world found him interesting without the title, doing the work of making him interesting. She said this, and then she looked at him directly and said that the thing she was less sympathetic to was the letter. He said he had thought about the letter. He said his secretary had sent that letter, and he had not known about it, which was true. And he said this was not an excuse, which was also true, because the secretary had been acting on his instructions, and the instructions had been that charitable commitments were fully subscribed, which they had been at the time, and the instruction had been applied without the secretary's knowledge of what the proposal was, which was also true, and none of it changed the fact that Clara had sent a letter on behalf of the most important thing she was trying to do, and the letter had come back with a courteous dismissal. She said, yes, she said that was the thing. She said she did not blame him for not reading every letter that came to the Ashford office, because she understood that a duke with a large estate and parliamentary responsibilities received more correspondence than any person could individually read and respond to. She said what she had felt when the letter came back was not anger at him personally, but something more diffuse and more difficult, the specific feeling of sending something that matters into the world and having the world send it back without opening it. And that the Duke of Ashford had been, in her mind, for 3 years, not a person, but a closed door. He said he wanted to open it. She looked at him. He said he wanted to fund the school. He said he had been thinking about it since she had told him about it, and he had spoken to Nathan, and he had looked at what his available resources were, and what the realistic costs of the proposal were based on what she had told him, and he believed the school was fundable and buildable within a time frame that was not theoretical, but actual. She said she was not interested in the title's charity. She said it with the directness that was, he had learned, simply how she said things, not aggressively, not defensively, but with the clarity of someone who has been very specific about what they want and does not intend to accept something that only resembles it. He said he understood the difference between charity and investment, and that what he was proposing was an investment in something that would outlast the proposal and serve people who needed it, and that the school would carry the name she wanted it to carry, which was Julian Winthrop, not Ashford, not the Duke's generosity, but Julian, and that was the form in which he intended to make it available, if she would accept it on those terms. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she had another condition. He said he was listening. She said Nathan should be able to use sign language publicly, fully, without having to manage himself, or keep his hands still, or perform normality for the convenience of people who were not trying to accommodate him, and that this was not a condition about the school, but about something else. And she looked at him with the directness that required no softening, and he received it with the stillness of a man receiving something that is true. He said yes. He said it without qualification and without the delay of someone deciding whether to agree. He said yes, and he meant it with the specific weight of a man who has just understood, clearly and completely, the thing he should have understood 3 years ago. She said there was one more thing. He waited. She said she had spent the past 3 weeks becoming increasingly clear that Sebastian Ashford, Duke or not, was someone she found herself thinking about at hours when she had previously found thinking about other things quite manageable, and that this was inconvenient, and she was not entirely sure what to do with it, and she was telling him because she was a person who said true things when the saying of them was the honest choice, and this was the honest choice. He looked at her. She looked at him. The climbing rose continued its investigation of the window above them. The morning was warm and golden, and the rose garden smelled the way it smelled, which was the way that things smell when they are exactly what they are supposed to be. He said he had been watching her from the library window every morning for 8 days. She said she knew. He said Nathan had told him she knew. She said Nathan had not told her Sebastian was watching, that she had simply known because the library window was not invisible from the east garden, and she had good eyesight. He laughed. She did not laugh, but her mouth did the thing it did instead of laughing, the small, precise thing that was more specific than a laugh and more hers. He said he would like to call on her properly, when they were back in London, with her full knowledge of who he was and what he intended, and she said she thought that would be reasonable. He said he had one thing to do first. She asked what. He said he needed to write to his secretary. She understood what he meant, and she said, quietly, that she appreciated it. And he understood from the way she said it that the 3 years of the closed door were not a small thing, and that his understanding of their not being a small thing was the thing she was appreciating, not the rectifying of them specifically, but the understanding. They walked back to the house. The gravel was warm under their feet, the morning well along now, the gold of it moving toward the fuller brightness of late morning. They walked without touching and without ceremony, simply walking back from a place where something had been established, and the establishment was quiet and did not require announcement. and the house received them back into its ordinary morning with the complete indifference of a house that has seen people walk back from gardens before and will see it again. The summer continued. It continued with the quality of a summer that has been changed by something and is accommodating the change in the way that good summers do, which is without drama and with a great deal of warmth. Nathan and Clara's mornings in the rose garden continued and became, over the weeks, an ongoing conversation that ranged across subjects with the free movement of people who have found a shared frequency and are enjoying moving along it. James Harrington had become a genuine student of sign language and was making progress that surprised him and pleased Nathan considerably. Lord Harrington had invited himself to the garden one morning and been taught 3 signs by Nathan, who had taught with the patience and slight formality of someone taking the role of teacher seriously, and Lord Harrington had gone back to the house well satisfied with himself and had demonstrated the signs at dinner that evening, to Eleanor's delight and Captain Fellowes's polite interest. Sebastian came to the garden some mornings, not to join the conversation, but simply to be near it, and his presence there became over time natural in the way that his absence from it been natural in the beginning, and Nathan looked up at him, sometimes with the expression of someone who has been found, rather than managed, and Sebastian received that expression with the particular care of a man who understands the value of what has been given to him. He wrote to his secretary. He wrote a letter that was specific and thorough and left no room for interpretation. And the letter established the Winthrop Educational Foundation, with an endowment that Clara had said was the figure she had calculated. And he added 15% to the figure because he had done his own calculation and found her calculation was exactly right, but that the 15% would provide the kind of institutional stability that meant the school would not be vulnerable to the kind of financial pressure that caused good projects to fail in their second year. He told Clara what he had done. She looked at the figure for a long time without speaking. She did not cry. She was not a person who cried in front of people. And he had understood this about her early and was not waiting for it. She said it was more than she had asked for. He said yes. She said she had told him she was not interested in the title's charity. He said it was not charity. She looked at him and said the 15% felt like charity. He said it felt like mathematics to him, and that the difference between an underfunded girls' school and a stable school was whether the mathematics had been done properly, and that he had done the mathematics properly. She considered this. She said she would accept it if the 15% was designated specifically for teacher salaries. He said that was an excellent designation and that he would amend the letter to specify it. She said fine. He said fine. They were standing in the library. Eleanor was playing the pianoforte in the next room, more precisely than she had been 2 weeks ago, because Nathan had been teaching her something about rhythm by putting his hand on the case and feeling the vibration, and Eleanor had found this entirely fascinating and had been practicing. The music moved through the wall between the rooms, and Sebastian looked at Clara in the library light, the afternoon coming through the tall windows, and he thought about the letter she had sent 3 years ago, and the door that had been closed, and the 3 years of continuing to try anyway, and he thought about Julian Winthrop and Nathan Ashford, and the specific gravity of the things people carry that they do not put down. And he thought about the rose garden on the first morning, and the quality of the silence and the way she had looked at the climbing rose, as though it was the most natural thing to find interesting. He said he had something else to say. She waited. He said he understood that she had known him for 3 weeks, and that 3 weeks was not a long time, and that he was not asking her to feel anything on a schedule that suited him, but that he wanted to be honest with her about what he felt, because she was a person who said true things, and he had found that being in her company made him want to be a person who said true things And the true thing he wanted to say was that he was in love with her, not with the idea of her or the circumstance of her or the gratitude that people sometimes confused with love, but with her specifically, the woman who went to gardens at dawn and said difficult things without making them into performances, and spent 3 years building something that the world was not helping her build, because she had decided it deserved to be built. She looked at him for a long time. He stood in it and did not rush it. She said she had told him in the rose garden that she had been thinking about him at inconvenient hours. He said yes. She said she supposed that was, from her, the equivalent of what he had just said. He said he understood the equivalence and valued it. She said she needed him to understand that the school came first, that it had come first for 3 years and it would continue to come first, and that she would not be a decoration or an arrangement but herself, with the projects and the commitments and the opinions that were already hers. He said that was precisely what he wanted. She said she would need to see evidence of that over time, and not just in the declaration of it. He said that was fair and that he intended to provide it. She said she was going to accept his courtship if that was what he was proposing, with the full understanding that the Julian Winthrop School would open in the spring, and that she intended to be actively involved in its operation, and that he should have no illusions about how much of her attention that would require. He said it sounded, to him, like exactly the kind of life worth having. She thought so too. They came back to London in August. The summer had been what summers at country houses are when they go well, which is not restful exactly, but restorative, the kind of time that does not remove the difficulties of life, but provides enough distance from them that they can be seen in their actual size, rather than the size that proximity makes them. Nathan came back to London different, not changed in any way that the world would have found dramatic. He was still deaf. He still moved through the world with the practiced attention of a man who has learned to read it without sound. But he moved differently. The bracing was gone, or mostly gone. The small preparation before entering rooms, the invisible squaring of himself against whatever the room might do, the careful management of his hands in company. He came back from Dorset having learned, or perhaps having remembered, that the management was optional and that the world did not collapse when it was set down. Sebastian was careful not to make this into a thing. He was careful not to celebrate it in ways that would make Nathan feel observed, because Nathan had spent enough of his life being observed by people who meant well, and Sebastian understood, now, that the deepest respect he could show was to let the change be ordinary. He let Nathan sign at dinner. The first time it happened in London, at a dinner at the Ashford townhouse, with 2 guests who were Sebastian's associates from the House of Lords. Nathan's hands moved in the automatic grammar of someone who has remembered that this is how he talks, and Sebastian signed back, and the 2 dinner guests paused for a moment, and then one of them asked, with genuine curiosity rather than social performance, whether that was sign language. And Sebastian said yes and offered, briefly, to explain the basic grammar if the question was a real one, and the man said it was a real one. And Nathan spent 11 minutes explaining the grammar of sign language to a member of the House of Lords who was 49 years old and had never previously considered that sign language had a grammar, and was, by the end of those 11 minutes, visibly delighted by the discovery. Sebastian watched his brother explain the grammar of his own language to a man who was listening. He felt the thing that did not have a name. He let it be the thing it was without naming it. The Julian Winthrop School opened on the 14th of March, in a building in Southwark that had been a warehouse and had been converted over the winter by a group of craftsmen who had been given specific instructions about light and space and the particular requirements of a building that would be used by people for whom the visual world was the primary world. Clara had been involved in every detail of the conversion, and the building that resulted was nothing like the gloomy institutions that served as the existing model for deaf education, which were mostly buildings that communicated, through their architecture, that the people who occupied them were problems requiring containment. The Julian Winthrop School communicated something different. It was full of windows, because Clara had specified that the building should be full of windows. And the light that came through them in the morning was the light that makes people feel that the space they occupy has been built for them, and not merely assigned to them. There were 12 children in the first intake, ranging from 6 to 14. There were 3 teachers, 2 of whom were deaf, which was unusual enough to generate conversation among the educational establishment of the city, and which Clara had insisted on, not because it was the efficient choice, but because it was the right one. Because children should be taught by people who could show them what they were capable of becoming, and not only what they were required to manage. Nathan was the oldest student in the first intake, and he knew he was there as much for what his presence meant as for what he would learn, and he accepted this with the equanimity of someone who has found, after 22 years, a purpose that feels like it was being held for him. Sebastian came to the opening. He came as the Duke of Ashford, not as Mr. Ashford, not in any disguise, and he stood in the light of the room and watched the children find their seats, and he watched Clara at the front of the room with the expression that she wore when she was doing something she had been building toward for a long time, which was the expression of someone who has been told by the world, repeatedly and in various forms, that the thing they were trying to do was not possible, and has done it anyway, and is not triumphant exactly, but is, in some more complete way, satisfied in the specific way of someone who was right, and has proved it without needing the proof to be about being right. He had proposed to her in February. He had done it in the Rose Garden at Ashford Park, not at Harrington Hall, because Ashford Park was where he lived, and where he wanted her to live if she chose to, and he had thought it mattered that the asking happen in the place where the answer would make a difference. She had said she needed to think about it. He had said, of course. She had thought about it for 4 days, during which she had continued the preparations for the school opening with the focused efficiencies that she brought to all practical matters, and he had not pressed, and on the 4th day she had come to his study at the Ashford townhouse and told him that the answer was yes, and that she had 3 conditions, and he had said he was listening, and she had said the school came first, that Nathan had full use of sign language in any room of any house he ever entered as an Ashford, and that the Duke of Ashford made a public statement of support for sign language education that appeared in the parliamentary record, not because she needed the validation of the parliamentary record, but because the children who would come to the Julian Winthrop School deserved to have their language recognized as a language by the people who made decisions about what was recognized and what was not. He had agreed to all 3 conditions. He had agreed to them quickly and without the performance of deliberation, because they were not requests for sacrifice, they were requests for recognition. And the difference between those 2 things was the difference between everything. They were married in April, 6 weeks after the school opened, in the church near Ashford Park, that had been marrying Ashfords for a considerable time and had not been required to do so in several years. It was a small wedding. The ceremony was attended by Lord Harrington and his family, Captain Fellows, 2 of Sebastian's parliamentary associates and their wives, and Nathan. Nathan stood beside Sebastian at the altar, with the particular quality of someone who is in the right place and knows it, and he signed something to Sebastian just before Clara appeared at the back of the church, and what he signed was the sign they had invented in childhood that meant something specific and private and good, and Sebastian received it and understood it, and felt the complete weight of the morning settle into something that was not a burden, but its exact opposite. Clara came down the aisle without ceremony, because she was not a woman who needed ceremony, and she looked at Sebastian at the altar with the look that was her look, direct and clear and not performing anything, and he looked at her with the expression that he had learned across a summer and a winter and the building of something that mattered. To let show. And they said the things that needed to be said in front of the people who mattered, and in the small church with the light coming through the old glass and making patterns on the stone floor. In the months that followed, the school expanded. The second intake had 20 children, the third had 31. Clara ran it with the efficiency of someone who had been building it in her mind for 3 years, and had every system ready, and with the warmth of someone who understood that the children in front of her were not a project but people, and the two things together made the Julian Winthrop School the kind of place that people who visited it walked out of feeling that they had seen something that the world was better for containing. Nathan became, over time, not just the oldest student, but something closer to a teaching assistant, working with the younger children in the way that people work when they have found the place where their particular form of experience is most useful. He was 23, and he was finding things. He was finding the things that people find when the world stops requiring them to manage themselves and starts allowing them to simply exist in it, which was the specific pleasure of his own mind, the precision and the creativity of it, the particular way he saw the world that he had been drawing in sketchbooks for 22 years, because drawing was the form in which his seeing had always been most complete and most free. One evening, Sebastian gave Nathan the ring. It was a small ring, unobtrusive, a dark stone in a plain setting, which had belonged to their father, and before that to their grandfather, and which had moved across the Ashford generations not as a mark of hierarchy, but as a mark of trust, which was the form in which the Ashfords had always understood inheritance. And Nathan held it in his hand and looked at it for a moment, and then looked at Sebastian, and signed something that was not in any book and was entirely theirs, and Sebastian signed back, and Clara, who was in the doorway, with a cup of tea, and the particular expression she wore, when she was watching something that mattered, and was not sure whether she was supposed to be there for it, stayed very still, and did not announce herself, and she watched the two brothers in the lamplight of the Ashford Park Library, and what she saw was not what she had come to find, but was better, which was two men who had learned, late but not too late, the way that love works when it is not trying to protect itself, but is simply being itself, which is openly, and with the hands showing everything. Outside the library windows, Ashford Park was in the first quiet of a spring evening, and the rose garden was several months from its summer fullness, but was already preparing, the way things prepare when they are in their nature, steadily, and without drama, and with the complete confidence of something that knows what it is going to become. The world in which Nathan Ashford existed had not become a world without cruelty. There were still drawing rooms where people laughed at the wrong things, and dinner tables where conversations moved too fast, and ballrooms where the light was unkind. But Nathan moved through that world now as a man who had found his language and his people and his purpose, and the world's cruelty had not diminished, but his relationship to it had changed in the specific way that a person's relationship to a thing changes when they have found something more important than the thing, which is that it becomes smaller, and they become larger, and the proportion between the two is no longer the one that causes damage. The Julian Winthrop School continued. Clara continued. Nathan continued. Sebastian continued. In the House of Lords, and on the estate, and in the smaller hours of the evening in the Ashford Park Library, learning properly, and with the seriousness it deserved, the language that his brother had always spoken, and that he had taken this long to understand he needed to speak too. He was not good at it yet. He was the kind of student who makes progress steadily without grace, who gets things wrong in the ways that show he is thinking, and then gets them right, in ways that show he has been thinking across the gap between the getting wrong and the getting right. Nathan taught him with patience and the slight, exasperated affection of an expert for an earnest beginner, and Clara taught him with the directness that was simply how she taught everything, and between the two of them, Sebastian Ashford, Duke of Ashford, learned to say what he meant in the language that had always been his family's language, and that he had spent 3 years teaching his brother to keep quiet. He did not make a speech about it. He did not make a public declaration. He simply began to sign, at the dinner table, in the mornings, in the evenings at the school, in the corridors of the parliamentary building, where people turned to look because they had not seen this before, and were not sure what to make of it, and he received the looking with the particular equanimity of a man who has decided that the world's uncertainty about what it is seeing is the world's problem to resolve and not his to manage. And Nathan, at the dinner table, signed back with the ease of someone who has come home to a language he was always supposed to be speaking. And the family that had been built around protection and management and the careful walls of love that looked, sometimes, like limits, became something else, something that was built on the same love but with the walls taken down, and what remained was larger and more honest and more entirely itself than anything the walls had been protecting. If this story stayed with you, if you felt what Nathan felt when his hands finally moved freely, if you understood what Sebastian had to unlearn before he could truly love his brother, then this channel is where you belong. Like this video, subscribe so every story finds you, and share this with someone who needs to hear that the things we hide to protect people sometimes need to be set free. Tell us in the comments, when did you first understand that Sebastian was going to have to change, and what was the moment that changed him for you? We want to know. More stories are coming, and they are worth the wait. We will see you in the next one.